it's finally here. After feeling like what felt like an eternity to wait for this game, Spider-Man 2 has finally landed on store shelves and has been in the hands of gamers for relatively about a month now. And now that I've put an unhealthy amount of hours into the game, I've come to one solid conclusion, and that is, I don't love Spider-Man 2. I only just like it. It's not to say that Spider-Man 2 is a bad game, quite on the contrary. Spider-Man 2 is a good game, I just wouldn't call it exceptionally great, or a masterpiece like many people are calling it. I think it falls a little bit short. There are so many things in Spider-Man 2 that left me scratching my head and confused as to the how and why. Choices that were made that I don't quite understand, but on the contrary, there are so many improvements made to Spider-Man 2 that it puts it leaps and bounds above the earlier entries in the series, and in some cases quite literally. But to really get into the minutia of the game, I will unfortunately have to go into spoilers, so if you care about that sort of thing, you've been warned. It won't be a blow for blow, but you catch my drift. Let's get to it. The game picks up several months post Spider-Man Miles Morales, and Peter and Miles are officially a tandem team working in sync. Both characters are trying to establish a work-life balance, but are failing at it pretty miserably, and this is emphasized right at the start of the game, with Peter teaching at Miles' school at Brooklyn Vision's Academy. Also, for the love of God, please let Peter Parker be a teacher. It was like one of my favorite things about Nick Spencer's run, and there's so many rich Peter Parker stories to tell from that perspective. Anyway, that all gets wrecked by a surprise attack on the city by everyone's favorite sandcastle, Flint Marko, aka the Sandman, forcing both Spider-Man to abandon their class and get into a big ol' fight. Not many games start off with a big old boss fight, but my god, Insomniac was swinging for the fences with this intro, and it's incredibly impressive. From the set pieces to the insane tech flexing they're doing, not only with just the sand for Sandman, but the loading of the city when Miles gets chucked several different cities away. Insomniac was definitely chefing it up with this introduction.
Taste it! Taste it! Taste it, taste it, taste it, taste it!
The story picks up, however, immediately after this, with Harry Osborn finally making his presence felt after being freed from his tube under the care of Kurt Connors and Norman Osborn. And as we know, Harry is carrying a symbiote on him, and it's keeping his sickness at bay. Craven, however, also invades New York at the same time, finding new hunting ground, and his reasoning for this is not what you would first believe it to be. You'd think the guy would have some basic form of motivation in finding a supergroup with other villains to hunt down Spider-Man, but his motivations lie with finding a hunt worthy of taking his own life as Craven is dying. So he seeks fellow killers to do the deed for him, and he wants his death to be a worthy one in one-on-one combat. Because of this, he's targeted Spider-Man villains in particular, and in the process ends up killing quite a number of them, including most of these are off-screen, but the one you do get to see is Scorpion, and man, this kind of bums me out. Yeah, I know I've been the one to rag on these Spider-Man games for relying on the same tried and true villains over and over again, but with Miles in the picture, there are a bunch of stories to be told that offing some of these villains without that development feels like underutilizing them. But on the flip side, Miles definitely needs some villains of his own, so I can't be too upset, but again, it does feel like a lot of story has been written off the table here. One villain attracts Craven more than the rest, and that is the Lizard, and after finding Kurt Connors and abducting him and injecting him with the Lizard cocktail, forcibly makes the reformed scientist into the rampaging reptilian we all know and love, but on steroids. I mean, quite literally, the guy is just gigantic now. But not before Mary Jane can find where he's being held captive and attempts to save the Doctor pre-transformation while Pete and Harry are en route. Oh yeah, Harry becomes Agent Venom, basically, same look and all. But he crime fights for a while with Peter while Miles basically gets neglected because Peter Parker is a bad friend and has problems dividing his attention. Anyway, their attempts to prevent a Lizard transformation go awry because Craven is on the premises and again forcibly injects Connors with a more potent cocktail. Peter, in an attempt to stop him and underestimating the strength of Craven, ends up with a knife in his gut and all but dies in this battle and is only saved by the symbiote taking over, departing from Harry and projecting onto Peter. The symbiote had been wanting to do this for a little while, and the game was heavily referencing this anytime Harry and Peter were together, but this was the most opportune moment. We now enter what is the Bully Lowenthal era. This is ultimately where the game reaches its peak in terms of story for me. Peter's relationship with his friends, his further alienation of Miles, his temper, which is on full display and never really explored outside of all this, makes Peter a much more interesting character because of how much the dynamics switch, and these dynamics are what end up attracting Craven to Spider-Man, causing the Lizard to fall into second place on the hunt list. But now the race is on. Because the symbiote was the only thing keeping Harry alive, and now that it's on Peter, Harry is starting to wither away, and as his health deteriorates, his desperation grows to be reunited with the symbiote, causing him to be more and more restless to the point where it's pretty lightly implied that he's addicted to how good the symbiote makes him feel, not unlike a drug addict. We've seen this story before, just under a different context. Peter, under the growing influence of the symbiote, starts to act the same way, as when Connors is cured, the entire reasoning behind his stress and anger over his friend's potential demise without the suit is gone, because Connors tells him that the suit has chosen him, and Symbiote Pete, now under the complete influence of the symbiote and the meteorite it arrived in, which was also in Connors' secret lab, accepts that and pretty much says, well, Norman's coming up with an alternative cure, so I'll just keep this. It makes me a better Spider-Man. And this choice provides a bevy of conflicts between Harry, Peter, Miles, and Mary Jane. Right after this exhaustive effort with the lizard, Peter is tired, heads back home to go to sleep, to what this game pulls off as its spectacular Spider-Man homage, where Peter is no longer wearing the symbiote is wearing him, as hunters had been tracking him throughout the night and located him at his house. This forces Mary Jane to fend for herself, with a knocked out Peter seemingly disappearing and with hunters invading the home. This ordeal with Mary Jane, alongside the other times in this story, has Kraven acknowledging that wherever the reporter is, so follows the spider. And I have comments to make about this later. I won't touch upon it now, I really want to, but yeah. Mary Jane's positioning in the story frustrates me to no end, but again, we'll talk about that later because it isn't just exclusive to her, she just happens to be a big culprit of it. Anyway, with the suit in control of Peter, it goes on a violent rampage, with MJ being desperate to figure out a solution to bring Peter back, with both her and Miles realizing he's not himself anymore. With Miles holding back the hunters from getting to Peter and sealing MJ and Peter in a tunnel, Mary Jane desperately tries to reason with Peter, but it goes to no avail because Peter is still sound asleep and the symbiote is fully in control, and it isn't until Miles is knocked out by who I assume is the chameleon in disguise with a trank, it never really is revealed who the sleeper agent was, that things start to escalate in the story, with Miles being imprisoned in Kraven's arena and being forced to confront and deal with all his hatred toward another captured soul in Kraven's arena, Martin Lee. This culminates Miles' main arc in the story, with him learning not so much how to forgive, but to move past. Not to let the doubts, the energy, the pain, and everything surrounding his insecurities and fears hold him back from being a better person. And I really like this arc for Miles because it shows a ton of growth, something that I see a lot of people say that they don't really get to see in Peter because we started out with him being Spider-Man so late in his career with it. After overcoming Martin Lee, also, how come Martin Lee wasn't killed? I just thought about that now. I should probably retrofit that later. Anyway, after overcoming Martin Lee and his powers, he catapults Lee out of the arena with instructions to relay to Peter once he got out. Martin Lee then proceeds to do so, turning a new leaf in life seemingly after all that reflection and his time in the raft. Not quite reformed, but getting there. Peter, now fully enraged, confronts the hunters at the arena where Peak Symbiote is on full display here. This is awesome, and credit to Yuri Lowenthal, he deserves all the flowers for what has undoubtedly caused some major vocal problems, because after all this screaming, oof, he mops the floor with Kraven, nearly killing him until Miles has to interject, and then Miles and Peter have to fight. And for me personally, this is the real peak of the story. This is where it reaches its apex. Miles fighting Peter to get him back to himself, and eventually does, is incredibly well done here. But the sad part is, the symbiote saga, Bully Lowenthal, it's done right after this. Also, where the hell did Miles get this container from? He was literally trapped in Kraven's base the whole time. Whoops! There isn't really a lot of time spent with the symbiote. Things relatively fly by quickly, so it does feel rather sudden when you do lose it because you can't help but feel that there was more story there to be told. Instead, it's scooted off relatively quickly for one reason I can only think of, and that's Venom. With the symbiote now off, Pete calls Connors to alert him, in which Connors says that the symbiote has to be destroyed and has to be disposed of at Oscorp. With Pete en route and awaiting Connors, he runs into Harry, who he lets know that the symbiote has to be disposed of because it's dangerous and he doesn't want Harry losing himself the way that Peter did. Harry, upset and feeling spited, swings at Peter with a cane, busting open the container that the symbiote was held inside, and then becomes Venom. For the sake of saving some time on my gameplay portion of the review, I'll just say this: playable Venom is pretty cool. He's simplistic, but he feels fun to play. Everything he does is done with a sense of brutality and power, and the animation and sound team deserve all the love in the world for helping reinforce how much of a freak of nature Venom is and can be. Also, shout out to that Ultimate Spider-Man reference. I do wish there were a bit more depth and a way to play with him outside of this brief, fleeting moment, but I suppose it was meant to be more of a taste of what could potentially come, though I don't know how, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Anyway, with Harry fully bonded to the symbiote and escaping Oscorp, and Kraven still on the prowl, the two finally meet at Times Square, where a battle between the two ensues, and Kraven meets his end via Pac-Man fever. Yeah, that was kinda sudden, but an awesome moment for Venom fans, no doubt, and something I'm sure many didn't see coming. After that dispatching, the game seemingly flips a switch and goes full-on Web of Shadows mode, well, Web of Shadows light mode, beginning the symbiote invasion. But not before a very, and I don't know how to say this, confusing moment in the game's story. You see, with a bitter Harry and a creative team that is undoubtedly fans of late 80s and early 90s symbiote stories, Harry takes a trip to the Parker household for a very tense meeting with Peter and Mary Jane, trying to convince them, more like force them to accept the change of healing the world, Venom style, and infecting everyone with symbiosis. Venom gets mad when it's referred to as a thing, attacks Peter in his own house, and then infects Mary Jane as Insomniac's version of Scream before throwing Peter through a wall of his own house and is forced to have a domestic with Mary Jane Scream, or as I like to call her, Gotenks, because that's all I can hear. This is where I went from enjoying what was transpiring on screen to actually being bewildered as to what was happening. Maybe it's because I'm a film student now, and so I'm a bit more critical of the logical holes in the narrative, but like, everyone should know within this square block who Spider-Man is, right? Like, everyone should know Spider-Man lives at this house in particular, because between the hunters tracking him there and having all this commotion before with the symbiote slamming fools and making all this noise, and Kraven blasting it to the airwaves that the redhead woman, the loud motorcycle driving one that people are keen to notice in a quiet suburban, practically white neighborhood, is involved with Spider-Man because she's always where he is, would probably attract attention and arise some suspicions, wouldn't you think? This would definitely confirm to them that that is the case, because what the actual hell is this? If you want to pay your homage to Amazing Spider-Man 299, there are ways of doing that that have more logical sense than this. And that's my problem with how they position Mary Jane in this game. I'm sorry, I couldn't wait to talk about this. The Spider-Men go through so much trouble concealing their identity, and then there's Mary Jane, who is the biggest flag bearer ever as to who the veteran Spider-Man is, because she is always around and involved. I don't oppose to her being a big part of the story. I don't oppose to her being involved, but I do oppose using her as recklessly as they do here, and there not being any consequences for it, especially after Venom is defeated, where she holds the hand of Spider-Man in clear view of Norman, who then goes on to look like an idiot to ask Otto at the raft about who the Spider-Man are. Like, hello? Did you not look at the people who were there? And don't give me the whole cover story that she's a reporter going boots on the ground for a story, as if she'd be the only one doing that. And how does she get access to the Spider-Man all that close up? At least in Ultimate Spider-Man, Mary Jane and Peter were smart enough to always have a dedicated space to meet up, something that doesn't apply to these two terrible communicators. Anyway, after their domestic, Venom goes full-on Web of Shadows proper with the invasion, with Peter and Miles attempting to stop the ruckus at City Hall, only for Pete to get overwhelmed and reinfected with the symbiote, because as we were told in an audio clip earlier, despite the fact that he had removed the symbiote from his body, traces of it still remain in his mind, meaning he's not 100% rid of it? I got things to say about this too, but first, Martin Lee shows up to save Miles from the symbiotes, as it's established earlier that the symbiotes fear his power for some weird reason, and that the two work together to go in the mind of Peter to clear out the symbiote. They succeed, and the remaining symbiote is removed from the mind and turned into Anti-venom. Once again, Insomniac's A-Team decides that we need another anti-villain suit at the end of their game for reasons. And look, I'm not gonna get into specifics about the suit until later, but for now, I'll just say the suit itself, minus the obvious nod to McFarlane with the eyes, which I like, is pretty uninspired, but its inclusion in the game creates another massive logical narrative hole for me. Also, while I'm at it, Miles' evolved suit is not great, and I hate everything that it represents and everything that it undoes in Miles' own game. If you want to have a collaboration with Adidas, that's totally fine, but next time, make it a mission chain rather than force your players to wear a walking advertisement, because it's bad enough taking away player choice, which you've given us with Miles' own game, but forcing us with the suit is extremely wrong, especially when you have so many options to choose from that you essentially strip that away from us because we have to play the game how you want us to. I'm getting ahead of myself with that point, so we'll continue on with the story. With this anti-venom suit, symbiotes now take extra damage, and you have regained access to all of your previous symbiote abilities from before, and a couple of new ones. This allows you to take symbiotes on with more ease, as they are the toughest enemy in the game from a health perspective, and how you take care of Harry, who Connors believes is too far gone and perfectly bonded with the Venom symbiote and needs to die in order to take care of the problem. Peter fights Harry and doesn't really succeed in taking down Venom, but Miles is a little bit more capable and holds his own, while Peter grabs his bearings and administers the anti-venom to rid Harry of the symbiote once and for all, who without the suit to cure him seemingly dies until Miles defibrillates Harry back to life and into a coma, wiping out all the remaining symbiotes using the particle accelerator he charged up to destroy the meteorite. Norman, angry at the Spider-Man, basically swears a vendetta and teases the G-Serum, and then talks to Otto at the raft. But here's the thing, circling back to the anti-venom thing. This whole Harry in a coma thing was so easily avoidable, and this is what frustrates me about the whole anti-venom thing. It's very obvious that Insomniac wants to do a Green Goblin story. They're not even being subtle about it anymore. Anytime you see Norman, he's basically kitted out in all green, so you know they want to get there. They want to drive Norman insane, so by the time he gets to the serum, if he's even going to be the Goblin, that it just amplifies his grief, his obsession into pure madness. But the way that we're getting there, based strictly off of where we ended off on this story in this game, is so messy that I can't enjoy it. Peter has the anti-venom suit. The game establishes pretty quickly into his usage of said suit that it's essentially the same as the black symbiote, but without the hive mind controlling the host. The host is in 100% control. Peter knows that Harry needs the symbiote to survive. Why doesn't he just give the suit to Harry? This isn't like before where the suit refuses to go back to Harry. Peter's in full control now. The suit would heal Harry. He'd avoid being in a coma. They can be spider pals like they originally planned. This suit and its very existence is a contradiction so massive to its ending that it actively makes me dislike it. It feels like its inclusion was poorly thought out because the creative heads thought it'd be a cool inclusion, much like the Mary Jane Scream boss fight, and also an easy way to re-establish symbiote abilities, which they knew players were looking forward to and would be bummed if they didn't get access to again, seeming that the symbiotes get wiped out at the end of the game. But the fact that Peter, in all that knowledge within his big brain, didn't even consider this as an option to give Harry the suit is insane to me. But again, Insomniac had a specific vision in mind with their setup, and this is the way that they're justifying it. I just don't think it was as cohesive as it could have been. A lot of this game's third act reminds me heavily of Uncharted 3, and that's not a great comparison to make. Uncharted 2 was such a successful game commercially and critically that the hype for Uncharted 3 was through the roof, and Sony knew it too, which is why they forced Naughty Dog to release the game on their targeted November release date, specifically to sell console units for the holiday season. The result was a game that was rushed and felt very disjointed narratively because the developers were developing the game's story around set pieces and then retrofitting the game's narrative around that. And that's kind of how the third act of this game feels. Everything up until the Kraven death is fine. The Peter symbiote arc feels a little rushed, but it's definitely got its moments. But everything post that feels so drastically off the rails that it's hard to really enjoy because of how massive the logical leaps I have to take with the story. The other problem you run into is that Harry as Venom isn't compelling. Not compelling enough to carry the third act. I'm sorry, but that's the truth. This is no Doc Ock, and I'm sure everyone will agree with me on this one. Spider-Man 2018's story with Ock is tragic because you knew what was going to happen, yet you couldn't prevent it. And it took its time getting there. But the real gut punch was the thing that no one was really expecting, which was Otto knowing the entire time that you were Spider-Man and yet still did all of these terrible things to hurt Peter. There's nothing here that comes even close to that level of drama, despite their attempts to get you there. And bless these actors because they really tried, but the material wasn't nearly as strong. Maybe it's because so much of the history of Peter was glossed over that we're not connected despite the attempts, but I found Miles' arc, however brief it might have been, to be much more compelling all around because we've seen everything we needed to understand his position. He feels more real than Peter does, and his obscene and chaotic relationships. He feels more grounded. Also, this notion of having symbiotes still stuck in your mind, does that apply to Harry? Because he's been attached to the suit for a considerable amount of time, which would make him needing the anti-venom suit even more of a necessity. What about Mary Jane or the other citizens of New York? I gotta move on. But I do think having Harry be Venom and going with the storyline of symbiote invasion, aka healing the world, was a massive disservice to both characters. Harry feels a little hollow, and Venom ends up feeling one-dimensional. I would have rather they stuck with Kraven for this story and then set up Venom for a different game than mashing bits and pieces of Last Hunt and King in Black the way they did here. But Venom sells because he's popular, so, throw him in the game. Advertise, advertise, advertise. It is what it is. But even if this were the case, the story is built around redemption. So many characters in this game get something of a redemption arc. Tombstone, Mysterio, Mr. Negative, Harry becoming Venom, and doing all these terrible things could have had its own redemption story and still work with the goals they had in mind for the future. Peter can get the Venom symbiote off of Harry using the anti-venom suit, because the suit is afraid of its powers, correct? So the symbiote could retreat, ultimately giving up the host in exchange for its own personal survival. This allows Venom to appear again without completely writing him off the way that they did in this story. Harry is still dying, and this is where Peter can give him the anti-venom suit after a talking to in realizing what the Venom symbiote has done. He wants to undo the damage, and now with all three Spider Pals working together, this creates a moment in the story that feels earned, considering that Miles and Harry don't really work together with Peter in this game, and having all three of them would feel epic. But a sacrifice ultimately has to be made, and it goes back to what Peter had said to Harry earlier in the game, that the hero stuff has hard choices that has to be made sometimes. Realizing the stakes he's in, the mistakes he's done, his own mortality, and how the anti-venom suit can help achieve the goal of healing the world, he gives the suit back to Peter, urging him to live his life and make their dream come true of healing the world, essentially giving him the key to. Harry then makes a phone call to Norman, who is beside himself and overcome with emotion. Harry then presumably dies. The threat is neutralized. Peter, after believing he lost his best friend, tries his best to live his life according to his wishes, hoping to help heal the world in another way, and then passing the baton on to Miles in almost the same exact manner that the game does. The actual story in the game does. Norman then goes berserk after losing Harry and has a justifiable reason to feel the way he does, believing that his son didn't have to die because his job wasn't being a hero, and that the Spider-Man, even if indirectly, caused it. This would make Act 3 of the game feel a lot more cohesive to me and still achieve what Insomniac is trying to do with this chessboard of characters in a way that logically makes more sense. Despite the story not really sticking the landing with me, Traversal, though, definitely has. Like I said before, it's almost impossible to go back to the previous two games just because of how expansive the improvements to Traversal are. First and foremost, the speed alone will have any fan of the character really excited, as you're moving at such fast speeds now that it can be a bit difficult sometimes to control, really bringing you back to the Spider-Man games of old, especially with the brand new swing adjustment settings. For a long time now, fans have complained, and justifiably so, about how automated the swinging felt in these Insomniac games, and their points were valid. Expression via swinging was virtually non-existent because your involvement was basically holding down a button. You could do it with one hand, it was that easy. But with the addition of the adjuster settings, swinging now feels a lot more satisfying because physics apply more properly. It's not 100% perfect, you still have things like Spider-Man gliding across the floor when he should be swinging, and momentum being cut at the knees and impossible to gain because web lines don't apply as properly, and clipping through buildings, not allowing you to really gain speed or maintain momentum, making certain things like vehicle chases being much more frustrating than before, but overall it's a vast improvement from swinging in the previous games. You still have things like web lines being automatically let go at a certain height of your swing, even though you can finally do loops in this game, but it's only activated a specific way coming off of a dive, which is weird. But now things like hitting the ground if you swing too low are precautions that you have to take into account on your swing, and it just makes the whole thing feel more dynamic and satisfying. But the best thing about this is that if this isn't for you and you want to play the game as you had previously, this is optional. You can still play the way Insomniac had you playing before if you choose to, but for me, there's really no going back. I hope this is along the line of a series of reworks for web swinging, because while the current system is fine and a little arcadey, and the changes made this time around are welcomed, it's still a little off from where it could be. Web wings are also a thing that you can utilize and are essential. Traveling to the new boroughs of Queens and Brooklyn can be a bit of a pain through traditional web swingings because the buildings are so low, which means web wings are truly a gift, and they seamlessly blend into any action, whether it's tricks, swings, dives, you name it, it functions. The few problems I have with wings is that it's tied to the triangle button, and so if you happen to glide by a crime and want to web zip onto an enemy, the game gets confused on the input and will basically have you stuck going in and out of web wings until the game realizes that there's enemies around and puts you into the aggro state to get into combat. The other is that web wings is kind of like the de facto way to travel. It doesn't matter what the top swing speed is once all the traversal upgrades have been unlocked. Nothing is as fast as you moving through a wind tunnel or coming off of a dive with web wings, and this is kind of wrong. It feels wrong. Spider-Man's main thing is swinging. Web wings should be slower than web swinging, like that's just the way it should work, but instead it's the other way around, so it is what it is. Despite the improvements to traversal all around though, one area that manages to get neglected still is wall crawling. This is now the third game in a row where Insomniac seemingly forgets that Spidey's stickum powers are a thing that they need to work on improving. This is embarrassing. Like, games 30 years ago got this right. And yeah, the city is expanded this time around, and this is actually very, very cool. The last time we had access to Queens was in Ultimate Spider-Man, and so I kind of miss being able to travel to these parts in a Spider-Man game, and it's awesome that we even got parts of Brooklyn here too. Coney Island being included is a bona fide treat, even though you can't interact with it outside of that one mission, but despite all of these inclusions and areas added, I'm a little disappointed by the lack of interiors that you can visit throughout the game. I don't see why we're not able to head back to the living quarters of both Spider-Man, or why interiors that were in past games, such as Theo's Bodega, aren't accessible here. Considering the changes made to difficulty in this game and how one needs to have a full focus bar to even heal their health properly, why not incentivize going through an interior like Theo's to go pick up some food to heal health? This helps the city to feel more alive by interacting with things within the city that aren't just crimes. Exploring is just as fun as traversing or doing crimes. The original Spider-Man 2 did this with Spidey stores and hideouts nearly 20 years ago. Oh my god, I'm old. And it made exploring the map that much more fun. But in this game, the only thing you can access is the street. You get booted out of the subway if you try going down there. You don't get access to the living quarters. There's no secret houses that you can visit, unlike in Spider-Man 3, where you can find all the goblin stuff, and all that stuff does add a lot to your game. I mean, sure, there's Easter eggs to be found, but I don't want to have to look through a window to find it, you feel me? Having stuff like this to look for and do might actually have helped the game too, as it launched with 0 things to do post the game being done. Combat bases, which are normal activities for these Insomniac games, are not replayable once finished. Crimes are repeated for sure, but unlike in Miles Morales, you can't actually choose which ones you get if you want to do a specific one, and the large majority of ones you get after Act 3 are symbiote based ones, meaning that if you're in the mood for something in particular, good luck. And the only things that do stay on the map for replayability are Mysteriums, neat little missions from a conceptual standpoint that are tied to a specific challenge of some sort, but these are only accessible by Miles and are locked down to him, meaning that as Peter, you have 0 to do once you've done everything else that you can possibly do. Oh yeah, by the way, this guy that appears after crimes, yeah, he's the new Balloon Kid. Piss off. While the game does have side missions, and some are great, the Howard one in particular is a standout. The game struggles to make many of them feel worthwhile doing because the only reason they're being done is to gain the rewards for them, and not because they're enjoyable pieces of content to do or have the substance needed to make them that way. It feels more like a checklist being met, which is never a good sign. Crimes do happen and often repeat, especially in the same locations, but can become boring after a while, especially with how some have been revamped, like car chases, which are so automated now that they might as well not even be in the game. All of this wouldn't be so bad if the game had launched with a New Game Plus, but for whatever reason, despite all the claims that the game had gone gold and all this other hoopla, Spider-Man 2 did in fact not launch with a New Game Plus. This is truly, what's that word again? Head scratching, and just screams of a game that didn't really get finished before launch, especially since this was a heavily requested feature for Spider-Man 2018 when that game didn't launch with one, which forced Miles Morales to launch with one. But don't take my word for it, look at Spider-Man 2's own city that screams this as well. Textures that properly aren't mapped or are broken, structures that are disappearing right after cutscenes, lighting that spontaneously happens even though there's absolutely no light source to be had at all, weird flickers among many other instabilities the game has, and that's not even talking about the numerous other bugs I've encountered, like getting soft-locked in a Sandman mission, being turned into Spider-Cube numerous times after they had allegedly patched the issue away, hard crashes. All of these issues weren't prevalent in the last 2 games, and that drags the experience down here. But to add more evidence to my claim that the game was not in the finished state at launch, are the suits. For some strange reason or another, virtually every suit that was in past games, on Peter's side in particular, are broken. This includes the upgraded classic suit known as the Stark suit in Spider-Man 2018, and the MCU Iron Spider suit. The web lines are completely busted on the red and blue, and the eyes are really weird. They have weird animations towards them. And on the Iron Spider, they're broken. You can clearly see where the visor is clipping. One hop into photo mode side by side shows you that these have been adjusted, which is strange because the models already exist on the remastered version of the game. So unless there was a brand new rig for Pete, which is possible because the Advanced Suit 2.0 has a new head shape, the reasoning for why these were touched up and not just imported is strange and confusing because the end result is a suit that ultimately looks worse. Hearing Brian Intihart try to explain that the suits needed to be PS5 sized is strange because they already were. So what happened here? Furthermore, the suit selection in this game is rough to say the least. While I'm glad a good chunk of movie suits were included this time around, the fact that they take the bulk majority of them is a little bit much. I understand on the one hand wanting to make everybody happy with every suit possible from the films, because that's obviously the most popular form of these superheroes in their mediums. And I'm certainly glad for the inclusion of a good handful of them. The Amazing Spider-Man 2, even though it's still technically a broken skin, is probably the suit that I always use, and I'm glad that it's finally included. But for every suit like Amazing Spider-Man 2 that we haven't gotten before, we get ones like the Inside Out suit from No Way Home, which I don't think anyone ever wanted to return. I don't like it. I don't think anybody else likes it, let alone make it the last unlock you get for hitting max level in this game. Weird choice. Then we have the stealth suit from Far From Home, which again, I don't really see anyone caring for or wanting or pining for it. And then we have things like the deluxe edition of suits, a series of collaborations from different artists from all over, some even from other PlayStation studios. And while I'm not mad about these inclusions, as overcomplicated and overdesigned as they may be, I'm not exactly thrilled about these getting a spot over suits like Sensational Ben Reilly or even Spider-Man Unlimited not making the cut. Both suits fans have been heavily requesting for years at this point, and then having to pay for these, it just kind of puts a bad taste in my mouth. There's a suit for both Miles and Peter that have cloth physics attached to them that is tailor-made for something like Spider-Man Unlimited to exist in this game, and yet, no dice. Also, the fact that Into the Spider-Verse's Noir suit makes the cut versus Peter B. Parker's suit is extremely confusing because Insomniac had the biggest layup opportunity ever with Miles getting all three of his Spider-Verse movie suits, and yet Peter doesn't get his most important one from that same film? I don't get it. I wish I knew what the criteria was because then I wouldn't be so confused. But comic book suits getting the shaft in this game really hurts. Gone are cool suits like Vintage or Animated, All New, All Different, Big Time, which again is another suit that's like tailor-made for the color scheme selector style system that's brand new to this game. Yeah, now you can play with certain sets of suits under an alternate color palette, and this is cool. Some of these alternate colors look better than their default in my opinion. Miles' tracksuit in all black and red is my favorite look for him in this whole game, next to his classic. But it just racks my mind that with 78 suits in total for these two, how little it feels that comic book suits were included or even thought of, more specifically for Peter. Miles at least has some, and I'm thankful for things like his 10th anniversary suit and his Boricua suit, or like that guy from IGN says it, Boricua, making it in. The goal the developers had in mind was to make sure that both Miles and Peter had an equal amount, and in this they succeeded, but again, I do wish the variety had been more diverse. Also, I'm not a big fan of how you can't select the black suit abilities again once the game is done. Don't get me wrong, you still have all the symbiote abilities from before and more, but if you're a fan of wearing the black suit post-game, there is no way the game allows you to have anything other than white tendrils for all of your symbiote attacks, regardless of what suit you're wearing, which is, again, one of many head-scratchers. It's the same problem with Surge mode as well. Everything is overridden by Anti-venom, and surely the developers had to have known that this wouldn't be something people would like. I don't want to be forced to wear Insomniac-based designs when I'm wearing a suit of my own that I have specifically picked, but this game loves to do that. Why even have suits at this point? Also, the black Raimi suit isn't even registered as a black suit, so that's also, you know what, we're gonna move on. And now it's time to talk about the thing I've been avoiding the most. Gameplay. Online, I've seen a lot of praise heralded towards combat, calling it improved and better than past games, and I disagree with this, partly. I think the combat in Spider-Man 2 is pretty cookie cutter and sometimes unfocused. First and foremost, let's talk about the good things. I think that the unlocks pertaining to combat extensions, particularly in the air, are great, alongside the ability to now bounce enemies around. Directional web yanks are nice and a decent method of crowd control, and wall thrashes are a fun little flurry of moves, and the symbiote abilities and Surge are really well done, giving you that hefty power and feeling of weight and violent intent behind all of Peter's actions. This alone, not to sound like a shill, makes the purchase of the Pulse headphones worth it, as the 3D audio that plays when you activate Symbiote Rage is so damn cool.
Also, this takedown with Miles, oh, so good. But one of my main concerns coming into this game was that if the game were to adapt the Miles Morales combat system with character abilities, which it seemed like they were going to during the previews, how would they find a way to not make that system stale after a while, considering that this is a much longer game than Miles, where that system worked in its favor? And the answer is, they didn't. I think they thought they did by saying, well, as two different Spider-Man, you can swap if you get bored as one. But that doesn't really solve the fundamental issues with combat this time around. You can't really spam abilities in this game like you could in Miles because they're no longer tied to how much focus meter you have, but rather you have a cooldown on this very not at all pleasant piece of UI on the bottom left of your screen. The way you get these abilities back varies on what upgrades you have unlocked on both of your suit tech selection upgrades, which tries to pretend to give you player choice, we'll talk about this in a little bit, and on your skills. But either way, character abilities are now the most efficient way to deal with large mobs of enemies, so now you don't really feel like you're empowered as a hero with a kit that you can play around with, but you're playing more of a meter management game by having to participate in a combat system that, if we're being honest, isn't all that good in order to get to the good stuff. Also, focus meter takes considerably longer to get in this game compared to before, so takedowns aren't nearly as frequent unless you're intentionally parrying everything you can, as it's the only way to gain focus at a faster rate, regardless of how the game tries to lie to you and gives you more depending on how high your combo count is. This is an oversight, I'm assuming, and turns combat into a system that should be more proactive because you're Spider-Man and you should be zipping all around and doing all that crazy stuff, into a more reactive system, where now you have to wait for enemies to attack and counter because it's the most consistent way to earn meter back for both character abilities and focus. And this just kind of ruins the pace. It makes the game just slower. It makes it a slog. Now you're just waiting and reacting, and I don't know, I didn't really find that to be interesting. Hand-to-hand combat has never been amazing in these games and is really only decent, and because it's virtually untouched from Miles Morales, and while that game did make some improvements, such as the ability to combo from enemy to enemy more seamlessly, it still isn't what it should be considering how much this game wants us to be doing it for ability meter gains, even if it is the least effective way of doing so, and this could be better helped by the gadgets in this game, but those aren't all that great either. Compared to how cool and unique the gadgets were in Spider-Man 2018, these are probably the most basic and uninspired of all the gadgets that we've had in these Insomniac Spider-Man games. We have 4 gadgets alongside with normal web shooters, rounding out at 5 gadgets in total. Upshot, Web Grabber, Concussion Blast, and Ricochet Web. Out of all of them, the gadget that I think works the most is Web Grabber because it's one of the few gadgets in the game that provides any real type of synergy with other attacks. And that's really what the focus should be with character abilities and gadgets, because synergy is what makes things look cool and feel good. It's also one of 2 gadgets that provides any type of support that isn't immediately available from a character ability move. Ricochet Web is essentially a nerfed version of Web Bomb, and is fine for crowd control and dispatching of normal enemies. That's about it. Upshot projects enemies into the air, which is pretty useless considering both Miles and Peter both have character abilities that do that same exact thing, and that most enemies in this game don't like you being in the air all that much anyways, particularly Kraven's goons who throw up air mines the moment you start getting comfortable up there. Then there's concussion mines that again just throw enemies away from you, which you have character abilities that do the same thing. The only time this gadget becomes of any use is during Act 3 when it converts into a sonic grenade. All these gadgets, again though, pale in comparison to the ones from 2018. Not to say that those were perfect. A lot of the gadgets in that game led to one-shotting enemies like impact webbing and trip mines. So yeah, there was a balance adjustment needed to be made to not have so many of those this time around, but this adjustment I feel has so far done it dilutes the combat. Spider-Man 2018 has such a large variety of gadgets that allowed you to experiment, whether that design was intentional or not, but it created a playing field that allowed you, the player, to be as creative as you wanted to with an entire toy box at your arsenal. And Spider-Man 2 limits you in this respect, but also gives you toys that aren't what you'd like or want. It doesn't let you choose. But the thing is that these gadgets were only made with combat in mind, which is a huge misfire. In 2018, you could use something like trip mines during stealth sections to help aid you. Miles Morales had the remote mines that could do kind of like the same thing. Here, you don't have anything for stealth outside of a single upgrade in your tree that allows you to do dual takedowns from a web line. That same web line that is weirdly only accessible from a story mission. Instead, all the stealth upgrades went to Mary Jane, who now sports a stun gun that gets upgraded several times over to the point where it's basically her becoming Mary Jane Wick. At least her sections this time around aren't pace-breaking and contribute to the actual plot in meaningful ways, despite my gripes with it, so major improvements on her end were made, and I don't mind playing as her this time around unlike before, but it all just feels unfocused. Not to mention that a good way of separating Miles from Peter from one another is by differing their gadgets, allowing them to further feel different from one another instead of homogenizing the experience. It makes sense. They have two differing power sets. Why not use gadgets that help cover up the weaknesses of each? Then there's the character abilities themselves. A big deal was made about Peter's new arms with the suit, and I don't really like them. They just don't feel like Spider-Man to me, and every time I see them, it takes me out. I might be in the minority here, but I'd much rather have the option to have more gadgets on my L1 wheel, or at least some webbing-based character abilities, than having these gimmicks, and that's exactly what they are, gimmicks, be an integral part of my gameplay. But the thing is that they're never used outside of abilities anyways. Even the game itself forgets you have them. You never see them in cutscenes after the first mission, and with how much Peter gets tossed around in this game, you'd think he'd deploy them once or twice to break his fall. But no. You also just can't use them in combat freely, which is just a big wasted opportunity. A surge mode for arms might have gone a long way into maybe making me like this arms. Like, you already had this in Spider-Man 2018, you couldn't implement them here, but you don't have that, so you're just stuck with the replacement for taser webs, you're stuck with the replacement for impact webbing, you're stuck with the replacement for suspension matrix, and then you have Spider Barrage. Probably like my favorite of the abilities that he has with the arms. The arms in a nutshell are pretty bland, and their inclusion doesn't do anything for me because it feels underdeveloped and underutilized, and not all that really fitting for Peter. Miles, on the other hand, angers me because they commit a pretty big sin when it comes to his abilities and how they're treated in a sequel. We spend a good chunk of this game unlocking abilities with Miles we already had access to at the end of his own game, and I hate when sequels do this. It just screams uninspired. And if The Amazing Spider-Man 2 got called out for this, you bet for sure I'll do the same for Insomniac. There is no bias here. And for the love of God, if I have to unlock the ability to web throw goons again, normal or brutes, one more time in these Insomniac games, I'm going to lose my mind. Miles' newer abilities, however, are pretty fun, and I kind of wish that the electric blue color were the default for all of his Venom abilities once he gets his final upgrade, because I find it to be much more visually appealing than the red-orange they had used for his previous moves. Something that bugs me, though, is that Thunderburst isn't considered a hit on enemy when used. I'm assuming this is a bug because it makes no sense to come crashing down on someone's head and not have it register as a hit, but it happens. The pretty cool thing to see out in the open world, though, is that characters can sometimes pop up when you're doing crimes. These team-ups definitely smell like the embers of what was once a prototype Spider-Man multiplayer, and I'm sure is making many fans pine for some kind of game like this, but I wouldn't get your hopes up on that one. Trust me. Difficulty has also been tweaked for the game, but I don't find it to be particularly good tweaks. Yeah, the game is harder, but it's harder in a way that isn't fun. Enemies on higher difficulties hit harder and faster, meaning that your reaction time has to be on point, to the point where it feels like Twitch-like reflexes. Also, the game still suffers from that same Miles Morales garbage, where enemies will just stop taking and registering hits on them and just roll away and try and hit you. Cool, we love that. But having to constantly have your flow cut off because you're worrying about a flurry of incoming attacks isn't as fun as Insomniac might have liked, especially considering the emphasis now put on to parrying, a brand new mechanic added on to this game. Parrying as a whole is a fine enough mechanic, but it's way too inconsistent for my liking. Half the time it feels like enemies hit you even if you get the timing right, which is tapping L1 as soon as your spider sense on your head turns red. Other times it just doesn't give you the option to parry even though the attack is clearly parryable, and you know which ones are because the yellow to red enemy attacks are parryable as the game explains, and blue ones are the ones that have to be avoided, and the result is you getting hit anyways. Take for example this exchange here. I clearly parry this attack from this brute, and you know I did because it gives me an updated counter when I do, but he goes on to throw me anyways. Why? And like I said, this mechanic is really important and a backbone to the newly designed boss fights. These boss fights are much better than those in the games prior, and for the most part are better designed, but relying on a system as temperamental as the parrying system can be frustrating, especially on a very strict timer. That's not really difficulty, that's just... And on higher difficulties, the amount of aggressors that can attack you are much higher, meaning that if you do parry an attack, the recovery time from that animation usually results in you getting tagged anyways, usually by someone else. a ranged enemy, more likely than not. You also run into the issue where if too many enemies are attacking you and you want to do a character ability to kind of give you some space, the game will read it as a parry attempt and not a character ability move, leading to an early parry and damage being taken. Not to mention that you often face enemies that are about twice to 3 times the size of you, so when you do start getting swarmed, it isn't exactly easy to keep track of Spidey's tiny head, leading into moments where you just can't parry because how can you even see? But more often than not, you get this. This is not fun. This is not good design. This is not good difficulty balancing. But don't take it from me, watch this video and have an actual Insomniac dev explain it to you.
We had a goal of combat for Spider-Man that was fast, fluid, and dynamic. On the combat team, we frequently talked about playstyle, flow, and improvisation as being very important things to us. Having enemies that felt dangerous but gave the player opportunities to flow was going to be the linchpin to our combat. The topics I'm going to discuss today are probably very familiar to many of you. However, as programmers, we often want to create a system, verify that it's working as designed, and then move on. And this is not how you make good games. I want to share with you some examples of the iterations we went through to get our combat fundamentals right. We needed to manage attacks and mitigate cheap hits, or else the game was going to turn into this.
No one likes having the game being taken out of their hands. No one likes the lack of player choice, and this is where I circle back to that point again. Spider-Man 2 feels like a AAA game developed and released in the year of 2023. It plays it safe, but it also undoes a lot of things that players really enjoyed about previous games, whether it's quality of life things or otherwise. In 2018, you were allowed to customize Spider-Man to a playstyle you saw fit to you personally. You can make him stealth heavy, you could orient him to be more melee focused, webbing focused, you had suit powers from which you could choose from. Miles Morales then came around and then simplified that same system a bit, but finally allowed you to play with whatever choice outfit you wanted, really allowing you to be yourself in that game. Then Spider-Man 2 comes around and undoes all of that, forces you into outfits you don't want to play in, tries to pretend to give you player choice in some very boring suit tech selection choices that are so simplified and dumbed down that they might as well not even be choices, takes away your ability to replay missions, doesn't allow you to change the time of day once the game is done, which I can't really blame them for since there was a bug in Miles Morales that they could never really figure out that kind of caused problems with trying to change the time of day. So I can forgive them for that one, but all of these issues compounded makes this game feel like it was designed in a way not to let the players themselves play the game that they want to, but rather how Insomniac wants you to play. The toy box this time around is limited. They're taking toys away and giving you what they want you to use. It feels like the handcuffs were put on this iteration, and that's kind of the problem with this game. It only iterates when it needed to evolve. It doesn't evolve things the way it should or would lead you to believe it would be. It just iterates. And yet, I can't stop playing it. It still is a lot of fun because at the end of the day, a lot of the bones from the previous games are still there and some of them are improved. And those bones are great, but that doesn't mean I don't have issues with it. Like I said, I don't hate this game. A lot of what this game does visually outclasses what Spider-Man does in other mediums, and it's hard not to gush all over it. But despite this, despite all of that, I don't love this game the way that I should, and the way that I was hoping that I would. Instead, I just like it. I don't see it holding me like 2018 did. I don't see myself having as much fun with it or being as affected by it like Miles Morales had done either. It doesn't matter how much window dressing this game might have. Yes, it's very pretty. The lighting is amazing. Sound design is immaculate. John Paisano set all his instruments on fire with the soundtrack. The expanded city is neat. The fast travel tech is insane. And the animation work is top of the line. And the ability to play as both Spider-Man, as Peter and Miles, is cool. I would have never seen this, let alone play this 30 years ago. But now, having played what I've played before and playing this now, it just doesn't feel like enough. For the next iteration, some serious work needs to be done, not just to further evolve the series, but also tighten up the narrative and many of the series' weaknesses that this game exposed. Things like the open world, which feels like Insomniac neglects, or at least doesn't place a big enough focus on. Yes, it is a superhero game, but you have to remember that it's also an open world game, and that the open world is something that should be focused on in tandem. Expanding the city is only as good as the things you do in them, and when all you do is travel streets and stop crime with little to no interaction in any other way, and side content that has little substance, it starts to feel hollow. Let me deliver pizzas again, for crying out loud. I know they were prototyped and ultimately scrapped in Miles Morales. Give us races and not just slipstream drone missions. Fill the world with things that would bolster the strengths of the environments and the gameplay mechanics you created, and also build the world up. But why stop there? Give us challenge modes, not unlike the Arkham series, stealth-only bases alongside combat ones, boss rushes, timed objectives, the list goes on. The work and the assets are already there. Repurposing them into something like the aforementioned modes can help the game go a long way into making you feel like the game is packed with content. Make the game feel more loaded with substance as opposed to style. Spider-Man 2 will be a divisive game for its narrative alone, but I suspect many will be pleased with its gameplay. I just wish I were, but don't let my review deter you. It is a great game. It's a fun game. I just have a lot of issues with choices made. But even then, I have fun with it in spurts, so it's well worth the money, and hopefully future patches will make this game more enjoyable. But my main hope is that the bones of the work done in this game and some refocusing will really allow Spider-Man 3 to truly prosper and get over that hill into becoming something greater.